Since the domestication of lightning, humanity has pursued one eternal question.
Can I lick it?
I was going to say, how can I play with this? But you do you, boo.
Pull the lever, Fluff!
We'll get there, I promise. But first, you have to understand fencing. Because humans have been doing the old stibbity-stabbity since... always. Just always. We see swords evolve as metallurgy becomes more refined, and as they face competition from ever-improving armor. Then, sides start rolling up with shinier, louder toys.
Like the hand cannon and arquebusier.
Exactly. But for some weird reason, Renaissance nobility types decided those were a bit too clumsy, random, and egalitarian for their tastes. And, actually, swords are...
an elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
Classic rich guys.
Yo. So, it takes a couple hundred years worth of oopsies and perforated lungs for what's considered to be modern fencing to coalesce around the safe-ish rule set the French masters were teaching, and we get the first of the 3 Olympic styles. Foil. One of the OG competitions in the 1896 Olympics, with women's competition added in 1924, sliding nicely into that global burst of women's suffrage. It was actually surprisingly common for the ladies of high society to fence. In August of 1892, there was a well-known duel between an Austrian princess and a Russo-German countess, with fellow society women as their seconds and doctor, all of which started over the floral arrangements for the upcoming Viennese International Exhibition. On the America side of the pond, the New York Fencers Club was the first in the Western Hemisphere, and by 1914, a full third of its members were women. So fencing, particularly the foil, was very much an acceptable hobby and social scene for the time. Suck it, Bronte sisters! Foil is a style that most fencers start learning in and is probably the most accessible for the first-time viewer to understand what's actually going on instead of just, "Ooh, lights!" All fencing bouts take place on this strip called a piste, which is 14 meters long by 1.5 wide, or 46 feet by 4'10" if you're counting by them their freedom units. Starting at the inside, you've got the center line, which is so utterly irrelevant it's embarrassed to even be there, and is dashed. 2 meters on either side of that, you have the en garde lines, where competitors start every bout, and after every point. The last 2 meters get a special warning zone paint job, because if a fencer is forced entirely off the back of the piste, their competitor gains a point. Then, for some reason, fencing whisses out and tacks on this boring runoff zone instead of a thematic blink walk, so that fencers can be like that kid who always cheated at Floor is Lava. The foil itself is tied for longest blade at 90 centimeters, almost 3 feet, but is actually the lightest and averages in the mid-flexitudinals. And while foilists can still use a French-style grip like the one you might be picturing, most actually prefer a pistole a la these for better ergonomics and tip control. Because foil was designed for proper gentle persons who preferred, life. The only valid target is the front or back of the torso, and off-target strikes stop play. But the very first person to strike doesn't necessarily win the point, because the foil also uses the concept of right-of-way. Basically, the first person to make a continuous, smooth, offensive motion towards their opponent obtains the priority for their strike. And the defender has to respond with a parry, knocking the incoming blade aside, or they can shift their body so that the incoming attack is no longer properly aimed. Successfully doing either allows the defender to become the aggressor and make their own riposte for a point. This back and forth can go on multiple times, and as a new viewer, it's really easy to get caught trying to track the sword itself, the tip of which can be moving almost as fast as a bullet. So instead, try to focus on the motion through the sword arm and body. Like every cocky idiot since time immemorial, these foilists decided that their super awesome skills totes translated to the real world, picked themselves some dueling words, and promptly got lay-stabbed by opponents whose rules were more
pointy and goes into the other man.
Which, since most of us prefer our squishy bits on the inside, was not ideal. So the fencing masters who didn't want to update their resumes decided to start teaching the back alley brawl version of fencing, Épée. Gone is that pesky hitbox. Now everything is a valid target. Boop them in the face, impale their toe, tickle that kneecap, end their whole lineage. Right of way? What right of way? Use the heaviest, stiffest poking toy. Light the lamp, get a point. Who hit first? Who cares? And yet, precisely because everything is the target, epeists actually tend to be a lot more cautious. You'll see far more positioning games being played, to the point that there's been a lot of experimentation to try to force more combat. The exception to this is when an epee bout is entering the final seconds, and the score is looking a bit lopsided. Suddenly, those 45-second hopping matches can turn into wildly sprinting or leaping at the leader in hopes that kamikaze tactics will be enough to flip the score. Sabre grew out of the shorter curved or semi-curved blades commonly used worldwide by cavalry and eventually naval officers. Obviously, owning and maintaining your own horse is expensive, even when they're more common than today. But at the same time, warfare no bueno. So not the first choice for an aristocratic heir, but for their little brothers or a merchant class kid looking to move up in the world, commissions in the cavalry or navy were solid, respectable options. And it tended to grant them entry into the very same social salons where their stupid big brothers were playing with stupid foils all stupidly. But sabers are predominantly slashing weapons, so that skill set they learned wouldn't necessarily translate well to the thrust-only world of the foil or epee. Naturally, they decided they would play with their swords in their own way. While thrusts are allowed in saber, most points are won through the slash. Valid target is everything above the waist, minus the hands. Partially because traditional, almost cutlassy garde is modernized yet still used, and partially because horse fiends like gloves. Then, like foil, saberers,
Wait, not saberists?
only if you're a heathen apparently.
So, like foil?
Like foil, saberers use right-of-way rules. Unlike foil, they had to be told to stop sprinting at each other down the piece. Also, unlike foil, women's saber didn't get added to the Olympics until 2004, in case you needed today's random little reason to be slightly disappointed in the world.
I mean, I'm smiling, but I am very fucking furious.
Cool. But I was promised electricity.
I was getting there. But first, pop quiz. Which of the 3 Olympic styles would be the easiest to electrify?
Them or me?
Yes, I'm Dora the Explorer-ing.
Okay. Well, epee has less rules, so...
Muy bien!
So obviously modern fencing is a lot faster and not so Hollywoodified as people seem to expect, with flashy twirls and witty repartee. And they tend to throw the blame for things like that at electric scoring, which is pretty inaccurate because it's a sport, right? Sure, it may have evolved from combat, but no one really wants to watch people unspooling each other's intestines while they're trying to enjoy the polite nationalism of something like the Olympics. But seriously, I found fencing masters and spectators lamenting the decay of the sport back when these freaky wire face masks started popping up in the late 1700s. And knowing humans, I'm sure there were complaints about it becoming too soft, with improved gloves or protection so ears stop getting Van Gogh'd too. Jumping ahead a bit here, but the longest competitive fencing match was an international epee tournament held in Paris in 1897, which was well before the standard electric systems were in play. And the gold medalist who won the last non-electrified Olympic foil bout won gold in the first electrified bout too. In fact, he's one of only 4 foilists who've ever won multiple individual golds. And here's the video of Olympic saber bout before it went electric. It's not that different. If anything, electric scoring systems actually made fencing more aggressive and athletic, because previously, the onus was on the competitors and the 5 judges to just sort of be honest. And so like any combat adjacent sport, where the goal is to score points through hits to the target area, you learn pretty quickly that you have to make sure your strikes are very clean and obvious, including things like, positioning your body so it doesn't impede the view of those judges. Hence the classic arm in the air pose, the right-of-way rules, and even playing to judges after every point. Of course, lower tech options for strike marking have been played with for centuries. A Scots fencing master suggested using a small sponge tip dipped in vermilion, aka cinnabar, aka mercury sulfide, which made this beautiful red lacquer dye used worldwide throughout history. It was so expensive and desired that the ancient Romans actually capped its price. And as for that whole mercury bit, don't worry, it was only mostly toxic to the poor sods who dug the mineral up or had to process it. When we get to the 1800s, you have inventors toying around with self-exciting electric dynamos. And it's not just your Edisons and Teslas that people always think of, but legitimate citizen scientists. They're attending lectures, devouring newly founded trade magazines. You have Jules Verne and H.G. Wells publishing these sensational adventures that seem to be just around the corner with new age magic of science. So of course it makes sense that an amateur fencer, clockmaker, and, father of the modern magic show who made these amazing automatons, and whose autobiography inspired frickin' Houdini's stage name, started toying around with a metallic jacket attached to a battery, which would cause a bell to ring when the circuit was completed. But by electrifying the whole blade, it was impossible for his circuit to differentiate between slashes and thrusts. So this 1895 demo in England actually skips the battery jacket, and it was designed so that pressing the blade into the handle completed the circuit. But obviously that can't determine if a thrust was into the torso or into an invalid target like the knee or the floor.
Why were they trying to solve foil first?
Because it was the most popular style by far. So while Épée and Sabre were seen as more militaristic, violent, and crass...
Oh, and that's why it took so long for women's Sabre and Épée to show up.
Pretty much, yeah. But that 1895 demo I showed you actually has the right general concept for Épée. So, using one of my handy-dandy victims from before, let's ditch the cape.
No capes!
Alright, electrical current comes from the power source. Duh, I know. Either it's a battery for wireless systems, or it's from the scoring box itself via this tethered reel behind their back. Then you can actually see the cord running in its own line down the arm of the jacket here before it connects to the sword near the wrist. The current runs up cord A, then just hangs out, kind of at this dead end of an open circuit until the little button here at the tip of the blade gets compressed, which closes the circuit and allows the current to continue all the way to the scoring box and light the leg. Then, after an incredibly short period of time, like 40 milliseconds in Épée, that scoring box will temporarily cut off the current to the other fencer so their light can't go off after that 40 millisecond window passes. Any fencer who lights the lamp gets a point. The last major concept to add is this third grounding wire attached to the bell, so that strikes made to the guard itself would take the far easier route for electricity and leap from the A wire straight into the opponent's C grounding wire, bypassing the rest of the circuit, so therefore not being registered as a touch. Likewise, to make sure that the Épée stuck in your opponent's toe and not the floor, competition pieces are actually made of conductive materials like aluminum, and therefore will also bypass the circuit just like grounding. Obviously, improvements have been made over time, but Épées have been working off this general concept since the Berlin Olympics in 1936. It would take another 20 years before foil did the same. The early jacket foil combos were too heavy, poorly balanced, and far too expensive for wide adoption. So globally, teams were experimenting with all of their own ideas throughout the 50s. The Russian fencers actually suggested a barely updated version of the vermilion cloth method from almost 300 years prior. And there were experiments in Hungary using radio waves, or my favorite, which was placing tiny light bulbs at the blade tip, and then using a long exposure camera to track the motion.
Like photographers light painting?
Yeah, the couple of modern examples I found.
Oh, that's so awesome!
Right? But no. Instead, they went with this meshy wire jacket overlay called a lame, which covers the whole torso target area. This time, the A line from before actually bites down on the lame. The B line carries the current both up and down the blade, through a closed current until it reaches C and goes to ground. So, when the foil tip is depressed, it's actually breaking the flowing current, which then triggers a white light from the scoring box, signaling a non-valid hit. However, if the foil point is depressed against the opponent's lame, the current will be directed through their A line, creating a new circuit and lighting the correct color. The biggest problem for foil is that the sheer bendiness of the blade can actually allow the current from the B line to flow into the opponent's A on a proper thrust, then jump itself back into the winner's B line as the momentum of the thrust bends the blade into their chest, therefore not registering as a hit at all. So to prevent this in less fancy systems, the section just beneath the tip needs to be wrapped in a non-conductive material like electric tape. Sabre makes things even more complicated by allowing those slashing motions to count as points, so the whole electric flow button as a gate thing doesn't work. Instead, Sabre forgoes wires in the blade entirely in favor of the whole gosh darn blade carrying an electric charge. Like before, the A line bites a lame, which now includes the arms and entire head. So, lots of conductive surface area, a right-of-way rule, and a whippy blade which is even shorter than the other two, and suddenly it is really hard to get a proper circuit because Sabrers are out here playing Twister with each other's electricity. So even though men's Sabre is the only weapon event to have been in every iteration of the modern Olympics, electric scoring in Sabre didn't even start until 1988. And even then, the system has received overhauls for almost every Olympics since. Very basically, the scoring box itself includes logic to recognize that few milliseconds where the whip over of your opponent's blade may cause it to touch you, even though your blade has already successfully parried the strike. The scoring box will actually inhibit that from signaling a hit. Now, so far, I've been talking about the fencing you'll see in the vanilla Olympics, but I'd be utterly remiss if I didn't mention the adaptive version for athletes with disabilities, because wheelchair fencing is hella awesome. It, along with the Paralympics as an entire concept, was the brainchild of a neurosurgeon who had predominantly worked with RAF veterans at the tail end of the Second World War, and who developed practices which literally raised average life expectancy of a new paraplegic from 2 years to decades. Fencing-wise, you still have foil, épée, and sabre, but this time athletes are locked in place to platforms on the piste, with their sword arms at a 110-degree angle to their competitor, and are separated by a distance chosen by the fencer with shorter arms. So instead of hop-skippity footwork, athletes are throwing their upper bodies around to evade strikes in addition to the usual parries. As such, competition is split further into categories based on mobility through the torso and arms. And épéists wear a blanket lame over their legs so that the electronic scoring systems will register it as a non-target hit, exactly like when an épée tip makes contact with the piste. So, that's fencing.
Wait, that's it? We're just stopping there.
Yep.
Hey, so thanks for watching.
Obviously, we're just still starting out.
But we've got lots of plans.
To connect the dots of the whys, hows,
And whos.
some of our favorite whats.
So if that's your jam, be sure to do the YouTube-y thing and like, comment, share, and subscribe.
And all that jazz.
La, da, da, da.